everyone, and welcome to Spirit Basics, the show for both the beginner and the avid connoisseur of fine spirits. I'm Jennifer Allan.
And I'm Stephen Olson, and today we're going to talk about Canadian whiskey. Let's just take the word whiskey for a moment. It comes from the Gaelic word uskebeta, which of course means water of life. We think it dated back to about the 12th century, and no, we didn't invent it here. It actually came from Scotland and Ireland. And when those settlers came to this country, they brought whiskey with them, both the product and the knowledge of the process. And when they tried to do distillation in Canada, they didn't find a whole lot of barley, but they did have rye, wheat, and maybe even corn, so that's what our early whiskeys were made from. And in those days, whiskey became such a commodity that it was better than money when trading, for example, with the Native Americans who were here before.
That sounds like the story of American bourbon, actually.
Well, it is very similar to the story of American bourbon right up until about now. In the 1870s, the Northwest Mounted Police, which of course later became the Canadian Mounted Police, the Royal Canadians, was actually formed to quell a certain amount of lawlessness that was going on in southern Alberta. The American free traders had crossed over the border from the Dakotas and Wyoming, and they were trading spirits with the Native Americans, and I think there was some question about their intention, as a matter of fact. Skip up to World War I. During the war, the munitions effort for the war to make gunpowder and so forth, all of the distilleries up here were closed, and as a matter of fact, they closed in the United States too. As a matter of fact, by 1918, every distillery, winery, and brewery in North America was making munitions, or they were closed. Now, in Canada, the distilleries were reopened after the war, but in the United States, they were not. As a matter of fact, in 1920, the Volstead Act was passed. Prohibition began, and our distilleries didn't open until 1933. And interestingly enough, no spirits were legally allowed into the country either.
But in Canada, it was a very different story.
Indeed it was. In Canada, you were much more practical. When you started your prohibition, you realized very quickly that it was a very important part of the economy and of people's lives, and so it kind of went away, whereas in the United States, it became big business, taxes, and gangsters. Now, you all know about Al Capone. Al Capone was running booze, as the gangsters called it, through the Great Lakes, through Detroit. As a matter of fact, about 20 years ago, they found tunnels under Moose Jaw where he had been operating for ever, and they'd never even known it. The rum runners came out through the St. Lawrence Seaway and out of Nova Scotia down into the eastern seaboard in New York. A lot of Canadian whiskey was going to the United States illegally, and if you don't already know it, well, let me put it this way. In the early 1920s, the Canadian whiskey jumped in production by 400%. Can't imagine where that whiskey was going to those thirsty Americans, but the Canadian whiskey industry was born.
Well, for his own look at the history behind Canadian whiskey, we turn to our master mixologist, Dale Degroff.
The early whiskey makers of Canada and New England made rye mostly, and they were mostly small farmers. It was a subsistence living. There were a few gentleman farmers like Jefferson and Washington who made some pretty good money out of distilling not just rye but several other things. George Washington had 5 stills on his property after he left the presidency. Rye whiskey was always sort of considered to be the whiskey of Canada. And even today, when rye just makes up a very small portion of a whiskey that is made mostly from corn, wheat, and barley, we still think of Canadian whiskey as rye whiskey. Blending whiskey, which the Canadians do extremely well, was really something that happened as a result of Prohibition, certainly in our country. Because you have to remember now, we were straight whiskey drinkers in the 19th century in the lower 48. We drank straight rye and we drank straight corn whiskey, or with a very little blend of other grain in it, mostly corn. And after Prohibition started, we destroyed all of our aging stocks of whiskey. And when Prohibition was over in 1932, we didn't really start production again until 1933. And we don't drink these whiskeys until they're at least 4 years old. And as you guys know here in Canada, 6 years old is the preferred age. So 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, then the war comes along. We're not making any straight whiskey down there of any consequence until after the war. So between 1932, when Prohibition was repealed, and the end of the Second World War, the best and the premium and the quality whiskey was all coming from up here. That's when Crown Royal and Canadian Club and Seagram's VO and all these whiskeys were considered to be the whiskey of choice. And those early Scottish distillers up in Canada, those independent souls, were the reason why your whiskey is still spelled with only a Y and not an E. We had a lot of Irish distillers in Pennsylvania, and they spell their whiskey with an E over in Ireland, and we spell our whiskey with an E down here in the United States. But you guys still spell it with a W-H-I-S-K-Y, like the Scotsman. It wasn't until after the war, when we started getting some aged stocks of American bourbon whiskey, did it start to overtake Canadian blends as premium whiskey. Premium whiskey was Canadian whiskey in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. Now, of course, what happened in the 60s was vodka started to overtake brown spirits, white spirits overtaking brown spirits as the spirit of choice. So another blow was dealt to American whiskeys, and we didn't recover from that until afterwards. So it's a great story, this sort of symbiosis of Canadian and American whiskeys, and actually bailing us out after Prohibition. Here's to you.
Up next, we'll talk about how Canadian whiskey is made.
And our spirit insiders, Morgen and Scott, go on another adventure into the spirit world when Spirit Basics returns. Welcome back to Spirit Basics. Right now we're going to talk about how Canadian whiskey is made. Now I think a lot of us consider Canadian whiskey to be rye whiskey, but it hasn't always been that way, has it?
No, absolutely not. As a matter, well, let's put it this way. Originally it was predominantly rye. It's not rye. Here's the deal. Canadian whiskey is a blend of grains, of which rye is one of the ingredients, so I guess we can call it rye. But there's no mandate in Canada about what kind of grain is used, other than the fact that it's a blend of grain, and rye is usually a component of the grain with corn and wheat. So unlike bourbon, for example, that has to have 51% corn, and in bourbon, if you call it rye, it has to be 51% rye. In Canada, there's no specific law about the type of grain. It's a blend.
Well, like bourbon, are there aging rules for Canadian whiskey?
Oh, absolutely. All Canadian whiskey has to be barrel aged for a minimum of 3 years. Now, Canadian whiskey by law is a blended whiskey. Not just a blend of grains, but a blend of the barrels themselves, blending it together, all right? Now, all of the whiskeys that you know that are on the shelf, certainly all of the premiums that we have here, are at least 6 to 8 years old, and some of them are much older. And I think that aging and that blending, both of the grains and the barrels, is part of what makes Canadian whiskey so smooth. It makes it so complex, and it makes the entire world love it so much, and why it's so great in cocktails. So, kind of like tequila has to come from Mexico, if you want to call it Canadian whiskey on the label, it has to be made in Canada.
Well, for more on how Canadian whiskey is made, we turn to our Spirit Guide.
So whether worrying about Canadian whiskey being rye-based or corn-based, I don't think that's really that important. We know actually most of the time it's corn-based. What's important to understand about Canadian whiskey is that it is a blended whiskey by law. Yes, there are exceptions, but by law it's supposed to be blended. And blended between what? It's supposed to be blended with a straight whiskey and a neutral grain spirit. And why is this important? Well, neutral grain spirit, as we talked about before, it's like a vodka. It's had the funky heads and tails cut off. It's clean and sleek and smooth. You blend that with a straight whiskey. Now, straight whiskey is distilled at no higher than 160 proof. Neutral grain spirit is distilled above 190. May not seem like a big difference. It's a big difference. Bourbon, for instance, is distilled at no higher than 160. And what kind of flavor does bourbon have? A lot of flavor. For some folks, too much flavor. So you take this straight whiskey, which is like a bourbon, and you blend it with this neutral grain spirit. And when you put the two together, at least half of it by law has to be this neutral grain spirit. Put them together. Now add water to dilute the proof down to 80 proof or so, a typical bottle proof. And you end up with a whiskey, when it comes to Canadian whiskey, that's softer and milder than the whiskeys that are made in America. That neutral grain spirit has helped soften and make the whiskey much more elegant.
Well, now that we've taken a look at the history, the origins, and the process of making Canadian whiskey, it's time for an inside look.
Our roving spirit insiders, Morgen and Scott, hit the road to see what they could find out about Canadian whiskey.
Thanks, Stephen and Jennifer. I'm here with Glenn to find out exactly how Canadian whiskey is made. So Glenn, we're standing in front of something that looks like a big funnel. Why did we start here? We put 5,400 pounds of wheat in there. We cook it under pressure for an hour and a half to turn that wheat into a mash. From the cooker, it goes into what we call a cooler, a mash cooler. We don't want to add yeast to the product at 115 degrees. It will actually kill the yeast.
And it all stays right here in this.
It all stays right there until the temperature gets down to about 20 degrees Celsius. And that's when the yeast is added to it. From there, we pump the product from the cooler into our fermenting tanks. What we're doing is we're converting the glucose, the sugars, into alcohol. And it usually takes between 60 and 72 hours for this product to ferment.
Okay, so it goes from those big fermenting tanks down to this little thing.
Finished mash is called a beer mash. That's the only reason this is called a beer still. We're putting the beer mash in there at approximately 10% alcohol. The product at the end is about 70% alcohol. From here, the alcohol that we take off to run it through our condenser, we put it into storage tanks before we run it through our pot still rectifier.
Isn't this whole process so far until this the same as you would do for something like vodka?
Yes, it is. The process is entirely the same. Until this is where we start making whiskey, separate the whiskey from the vodkas in the pot still rectifier. We run steam through copper pipes, which boils the liquid inside, causes it to turn into steam. Goes up to the top of our pot still. From there, it's condensed back into a liquid and goes into our storage tanks again after that. We have to blend that down to a certain percentage, a lower percentage, before we can start aging our product in oak barrels.
Okay, why do you put the product in barrels now? Why didn't it just go straight into the bottle?
Basically, the charred oak barrels will age the product, give it a little bit of color, get the oak flavor into it, a little bit of spicy flavor into the product. For Canadian whiskey, government regulations actually state that the product needs to be aged for at least 3 years.
What happens to it now? Is it ready for the bottles finally?
No, it's not ready for the bottles just yet. Now we're going to the blending line. This is our blending area. This is where we blend it down to 40% alcohol using distilled water or purified water at that stage. After the product is blended, we run it through our pad filter, which actually polishes the product. That's why it makes it really clear and takes any solid materials out of the product at that stage.
And then we get to bottle. Let's go to the bottling line.
Okay, let's do that.
Great.
And we've been talking a lot about wheat, but we haven't talked about rye, and Canadian whiskey is rye whiskey. So when does the rye get added?
We add the rye whiskey in the blend now, the rye flavor, what they call rye flavor, during the blending process, correct.
Okay, so now we're at the bottling line. We have this really noisy machine right behind us. What's it doing?
This is a vacuum filler. All we do here is we remove any air from the bottle itself and replace that air with product. So it's actually a vacuum being created inside the bottle. Caps are put on, they're screwed down, and then they're torqued down at that stage.
And then basically it's done except for the labels. Now we're at the end of the line and I can just grab myself a bottle and head home.
Sure, why not?
Great, well I'm ready. Glenn, thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Steve, Jennifer, I'm on my way back. Stay there.
You know, two Canadian distillers that you may have heard of, Joseph Seagram and Hiram Walker, who went on to become two of the largest distillers in the world, made their original fortune during the American Prohibition.
Up after the break, we continue our look into the spirit world with a lesson on how to drink Canadian whiskey and how to use it in some of your favorite cocktails. That's when Spirit Basics returns.
Spirit Basics is brought to you in part by Willow Park Wines and Spirits.
Welcome back to Spirit Basics, the show for everyone who wants to learn more about the world's best cocktails. Now, Steve, since Canadian whiskey has a lot of the same ingredients but is made differently than bourbon, how does it taste?
Well, it's quite a bit different, actually, and it's a great question because bourbon, one barrel, charred, has a smoky, dark, kind of spicy taste, whereas Canadian whiskey is always blended, and that tends to make it smoother and more elegant, a little more refined, a little more complex. Think of it this way, some of you have already gone there, but we'll be going there in a couple of future episodes. Cognac and Armagnac, Canadian Club, Canadian whiskeys, these are the cognacs of the world, if you will. They're more elegant and they're more refined. The bourbons are more of the Armagnac, the rustic, more savage American style, if you will.
So do you drink them differently than you would American bourbon?
Well, not necessarily. Remember, there are no rules or regulations. They're completely interchangeable whiskeys. You drink them neat. You might drink them over ice. You could drink them with cola. You could drink it with ginger ale, as you have it here. You might drink it in a julep or in a Manhattan.
Well, for more on how to enjoy Canadian whiskey, we turn to our spirit advisor.
Sure, Canadian whiskey is more or less like bourbon in Tennessee and the other North American whiskeys, but for all the reasons we described, it's a little different. For instance, when I get into a Canadian whiskey, I'm going to get pretty much every single flavor that I could possibly get out of a bourbon or a Tennessee, but now it's a little toned down. In other words, I can still get the fruit character, I can get cooked fruits, I can get tart fruits, I can get stone fruits, I can get all sorts of fruitiness out of the whiskey, as I expect to do out of any good whiskey. I can get the spiciness that I expect to get out of a good whiskey, from black pepper to cinnamon to clove to allspice. All that stuff certainly shows up. I'll get, no question about it, that nutty character that I expect to get out of these whiskeys as well, all the way with these great old aged whiskeys, all the way to chocolate and bittersweet chocolate, almost something like olive even. I can get all that, only you don't have, as you would have in bourbon in Tennessee, that ash, that burnt note that comes out of the brand new burnt barrels. In Canadian whiskey, you get to enjoy really the whiskey itself without getting so much of the barrel. Now, certainly there are whiskeys that are made with rye and that are made predominantly with rye. And rye whiskey adds yet another level to this. It adds to me a black peppery character. It is a grainy, oatmeal-y, almost sometimes black pepper character. Black pepper meets lemon, meets something citrusy. Corn, for me, a corn whiskey has its own distinct flavor. It smells like a can of creamed corn, but let's face it, most people drink whiskey with their favorite cola or their favorite mixer, ginger ale, soda, water, whatever.
King Cocktail Dale Degroff joins us now with a lesson on how to make a Manhattan with Canadian whiskey.
If the martini is the king of cocktails, the Manhattan is the prince of cocktails. I'm chilling up a glass for my Manhattan here, and I'm making it was originally a rye drink, born in New York City at the Manhattan Club. Angostura bitters, don't forget this in your Manhattan. You gotta have a couple dashes of it. I'm gonna use good Canadian rye, partly rye whiskey, and my Manhattan recipe, and I find most people like it this way, is 2 parts whiskey to 1 part sweet vermouth. And that seems to please most Manhattan drinkers. If you were to mix sweet and dry vermouth, you would have a perfect Manhattan. If you would use only dry vermouth, you would have a dry Manhattan. But I'm making a regular old Manhattan. And I stir, as I said once before, when I have all spirit ingredients, no juices, no sweet ingredients, and I shake when I have sweet ingredients and fruit juices. So let's stir this up real good. By the way, Jennifer Churchill was an American woman who was Churchill's mother. Myth has it that when Governor Tilden became the governor of the state of New York in 1880s, she came back from England because he had been a pal of her daddy's, and she made Manhattans for him, the invention of the bartender at the Manhattan Club. And here we go. Classic Manhattan. Wow. Anyway, Jennifer, Steve, back to you.
If you're making a cocktail at home that calls for either American bourbon or Canadian whiskey, you can pretty much grab whatever you have in the cupboard, because remember, they are interchangeable. It's more a matter of style, what you want to bring to the drink from that whiskey.
Well, now I know what to do if friends stop by.
Yes, you do.
And I know what to cook for them too, because after the break we head into the kitchen with some recipes using Canadian whiskey. Don't go away. Welcome back to Spirit Basics. We're in the kitchen and we're joined by our spirit chef, Chef Allan. Great to see you again.
Good day, eh?
Yes, Allan, we are talking about cooking with Canadian whiskey. Now, in previous episodes, we've talked about spirits from all over the world. How does our Canadian whiskey stack up when we're using it in the kitchen?
Well, you know, it's one of the classic elements of the Canadian identity is to have an inferiority complex about everything we do, but that is totally undeserved when it comes to our spirits. Canadian whiskeys are famous all over the world, and there's a good reason for that. They are wonderfully flavored, and they have really unique grainy and rye flavors, and they're perfect to cook with.
Well, tell us about the dishes that we have in front of us. Let's start with this one. It looks like we have a beef dish. How does the whiskey translate into the beef dish?
Well, it's perfect. Beef is really wonderful with strong flavors. So think about the things that people will eat beef with. Some people like horseradish or strong mustard with it. And here what we get is a really nice grainy taste to it. This is a beef with a whiskey cream sauce. And you know, we've sauteed some onions, we've added some whiskey, and then we've basically creamed them. So you get a really nice deep whiskey taste with that. And the beef is perfect. You know, it's a little bit fatty, it's got a strong taste to it, it's wonderful.
Now over here I'm getting a really strong curry aroma which smells amazing. How does the whiskey lend itself to this dish?
Well, you wouldn't think that a Canadian whiskey would go with curry, but the reason it does here is because we've got a chicken curry, and we've got a little bit of citrus and some oranges here, and we've got some almonds around. So we've got a really nice mixture of sort of nutty taste and fruity taste, and the whiskey sort of runs right up in the middle with that grainy taste, and it's perfect. It adds a really nice depth to this dish.
Now, what are your favorite dishes when you're cooking with Canadian whiskey? What are the kind of things that you like to make?
Well, I hate to sound like a stereotypical Canadian, but it's really good with things that can hold the flavor. So I like to cook it with game. It's great with elk. It's great with venison. You know, you can actually add a little touch of Canadian whiskey to almost anything to give it flavor. But the stronger the taste that you get out of it, or something that can hold that strong taste, that's what I like to use it for.
So these dishes, they're quite hearty, but can you use Canadian whiskey in, say, a lighter dish, like maybe a dessert?
Absolutely. In fact, you know, here we have some almonds on this plate, something nutty, maybe some walnuts, maybe something that's mapley walnut. Whiskey will add a really nice flavor to it.
Great. Well, I can't wait to try this curry dish. It looks absolutely amazing. If you'd like to try these dishes at home, all you have to do is log on to our website for the recipes. Over to you now, Stephen.
Thanks, Jen, for those great recipes with Canadian whiskey. Well, that's it for this edition of Spirit Basics. Join us next week when we take a look at the birthplace of whiskey, and we'll discover Scotch malts. I'm Stephen Olson. For Jennifer Allan and the entire team here at Spirit Basics, we'll see you next week. Cheers.
Special thanks to Willow Park Wine and Spirits, whose dedication to providing knowledge, awareness, and service to their customers has made this show possible.